Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This week, we're going to be talking about religion, and so I wanted to record a few notes on this and talk about it a little bit. We're going to talk about religion, magic, belief, and we're also going to talk about ritual. And this week, there's a couple of videos that I'm going to want you guys to watch that I think you're going to find pretty interesting. So, what is religion, first of all, right? Religion is about beliefs and behavior that are related to the supernatural, to forces, powers, beings, these kinds of things. Your book defines it as the means by which human society and culture is extended into the non-human, which, if I may be blunt, I find to be kind of a strange definition because as an environmental anthropologist, I also study the means by which human society and culture is extended to include the non-human, but it's not supernatural that I study. It is our relationship to plants and animals, to the natural environment, to the landscape around us, our conceptions about nature, how we think of nature versus culture, that kind of stuff. It has nothing to do with supernatural. So I find this definition very problematic and so broad as to be kind of meaningless. Instead, I prefer what I say here, that it is the beliefs and the behavior, the ideas and the actions, if you will, that relate to the supernatural world. Now, the difference between the supernatural world and the natural world is the natural world is something that can be studied, it can be codified, it can be cataloged. It is something that the scientific method can be used to understand. The supernatural, by definition, does not is not subject to natural law. Okay, so the natural world is subject to natural law, defined and explored by science, whereas the supernatural can't be. The supernatural requires faith. I cannot measure the afterlife or God or the spirits or the ancestors or things like that the way that I can measure gravity and force and the maturation of elephants, I don't know, those kinds of things. And so the supernatural is things that the natural laws no longer apply, right, of gravity, of physics, of those kinds of things. And so your book has a real strange definition for this, which is a problem if that's going to be her groundwork. So I want you, as we talk about this, and as you read the chapter, to think about it rather just as relating to the supernatural, right? As relating to those things. And as I said at the beginning of the class, there really is not the conflict between science and religion that you might have been told there is, right? Because again, as a scientist, I can't measure God. I can't measure a demon. I can't measure a tree spirit or a sky spirit, right? Rather, as a scientist, what I'm interested in is not arguing about the existence of those things or the impact of those things, whatever, because I can't apply tools to it. So it means nothing to me. What I'm interested in instead, as a social scientist, as a cultural anthropologist, is what those ideas then mean for people, how those beliefs and behaviors, those ideas and actions impact society. And so that I can measure, right? That I can explore. And so that's what we kind of talk about here, okay? So the elements to most religions, let's put it that way, not all religions, is cosmology, right? Which is an understanding of kind of how the universe works, a belief in the supernatural, right? Almost all, but not all, and this is where it becomes almost, is about behavior regulation, right? Not all religions actually tell you how to behave, and that's something I'll come back to in a minute, but most have that. And then pretty much all religions have some kind of rituals, right, which is those actions that are meant to bring about certain things, honor certain things that are related to religious practice and the supernatural, okay? Now, I want to make a quick note here, as an anthropologist, right? We often think of other religions and other cultures and peoples as being very homogeneous. And so we say that Buddhists believe this, or Hindus believe that, or Jews believe this, or Christians believe that. Or we say this cultural group, the Japanese or the Russian or the Swahili or whatever, right? They think this way. We often forget that these cultures are just like ours in the sense that all of you listening to this, I guarantee you there is literally dozens of ideas about religion that you guys represent, even those of you that ascribe to the same religion, probably disagree about some things. Those of you that are Christians, some of you are going to be Catholic, some are Protestant, some are Mormon, right? Some of you are more culturally Christian, and maybe you don't always accept the things that are said in the Bible, right? Others of you probably might interpret it as quite literally about what's going on there. That's great. That is the reality that we see around the globe, that there is a plurality of different ideas, right? There is a plurality of these things. We don't all agree on that. It is open to individual interpretation and individual reinterpretation. Many of the early Christian ideas about God and Jesus and everything, and the Holy Spirit and the church and this kind of stuff, are things that you literally no Christian believes anymore. The same can be true of Islam. The same can be true of Hebrew faiths. The same can be true of Hindu faiths. The same, on and on and on down the line, right? And so when we talk about these things, remember that we are using a term, whatever the term is, to define a religion that applies more or less to people. And a wonderful example of this is from an older anthropological text. In the very early part of the 20th century, an anthropologist was working with a Native American group out west, and he was describing their religious ideas. He was describing their belief structure. And he would go on for pages talking about their cosmology, and they believe that the universe is structured this way, and the afterlife is located here, and this is how you access it, and these are where spirits come from, and this is their powers, and this really complex understanding of their cosmology and the relationship that they had with the supernatural. And at the end of at the end of some of these things, he would often put in parentheses, Two Crows disagrees. Now, Two Crows was actually an informant of his. And if you remember, an informant is a person that a cultural anthropologist works with, right? And helps them understand the culture. And so you'll have different informants, and you'll talk to different people about these things. And so what this anthropologist was saying by talking about his friend and collaborator Two Crows was that while he was hearing these stories from other people, and this is what the afterlife is like, and this is, where spirits come from, people in that culture were saying, right, yeah, a lot of people told him that, but some said, no, that's all bullshit, right? It was his shorthand way of trying to get us to recognize, hey, Two Crows disagrees. Some people, some Christians, some Muslims, some Buddhists are going to say, well, no, that's not really how it works, right? There's a diversity of those ideas. And so we should really remember that as we explore this topic, okay? One thing that I want to talk about is what is the purpose of religion? And your book goes into this quite a bit. Let me start not historically, but contemporary, and we'll work our way back in time. I'd like to acknowledge my bias up front. I am not a religious man. I am a-religious in all of my behavior, right? But it's important to understand that even though I am not religious, that has no bearing on the fact that I want to understand what religion does, because it is an important part of culture. There are very few things that are universal among humans, and religion is one of them. We've never really studied a people that do not have religious beliefs. In other words, a belief in the supernatural of some kind, right? That can look very, very different, right? But the truth is that, it's everywhere, right? Today, I would argue that religion serves a multitude of functions, right? Religion is a form of community. It is one of the many important ways that we sort of connect with one another, right? It is how we build social groups. And connections with humans beyond our immediate family, beyond our kinship unit. Religion today often functions as a form of behavioral control, as I mentioned before, right? It can tell us sort of right and wrong. It does not do that for everybody. We'll come back to it. But it can tell us about right and wrong, right? It can also function in a lot of communities as a social safety net. You and I that live in the United States, we kind of rely on the government for that. That if, I don't know, if I'm hit by a car tomorrow and I can no longer work, right, there are social programs that both the city, the county, the state, and the federal government have in place so that I don't starve to death, so that my kids don't starve, so that I still have a home and things like that. previously that was the function of religion, and in many parts of the world it still is, right? And so that's an important part of it. Another important purpose of religion is to frankly give us hope, right? There are, as I said, there are things that I can't answer for you as a scientist, right? You know, you know, what happens when someone gets cancer, and how does that degrade their cells, and how does that kill them? A scientist can explain that to you about cell replication and errors in replication and what cancer is. But why that person over there got cancer and not that person over there, that's something different. You know, why things happen, you know, how that disease, and I know this is kind of a morbid thing, and I apologize, but how that disease impacted you, yeah, you know, yeah. But what happens after? You know, is there something after this? I can't measure that. I can't measure that. And so it does give us hope in many, many ways, right? And again, another thing that I freely admit, even as a non-religious person, maybe the purpose of religion is to explain what comes next, right? That's not the job of science. We aren't interested in it. We can't measure it. It's not something that we do, right? And so perhaps that's why, you know. There's a couple of different ideas that anthropologists have worked with over the years about explaining the fact that everybody has religion and what religion does for you. And to very quickly talk about these, because we'll discuss them more later, let me give you two theoretical frameworks that anthropologists used to talk about this. The first is cultural materialism, which is a theory that was first advanced and articulated by Marvin Harris. This is a wonderful book that he wrote, Cows, Pigs, Wars, and Witches. I highly recommend it. It's a pretty easy read if you're interested in the subject. Marvin Harris briefly believed that human behavior is best understood and explained by a response to the material world. That dealing with things like food and resources, demographics, population size, those kinds of things are the driving force behind why we do the things that we do. And so looking at religion, he was not interested in the supernatural. He doesn't care about that. He's saying everything that we do is in response to the material world around us. And so he said that religion served this function. And probably the most classic example of this is the prohibition on eating cows in the Hindu religion, right, in Hinduism. First of all, let me say that it is certainly more complex. I'm giving you a very brief overview here, right? So understand that this is the Reader's Digest version. If you ask a Hindu why they don't eat cows, the answer is that cows are sacred. But again, Marvin Harris is not looking at it from the supernatural perspective. Rather, he's looking at it from a material perspective, right? Harris, in studying this phenomenon, said that the reason that Hindus don't eat cows is because cows are worth more alive than dead. That eating of cows is a short-term solution to material life, whereas not eating them is a long-term solution. So what do living cows give you that dead cows don't? One, they give you milk, right? That's an important source of food. You can also turn milk into butter and ghee and cheese and yogurt and all of this stuff, right? And I know some of you might be nutritionally minded and you'll argue against the drinking of cow milk. That's become a thing. But in many parts of the developing world, it's a critical component to nutrition, right? So living cows give you milk. Living cows also give you poop, and that might sound strange, but in many parts of the world, including ours, historically speaking, right, cow poop was fertilizer. Cow poop was fuel, right? Buffalo chips, they used to be called sometimes in the American West. When it dries out, you can burn these things. So in prairies and savannas where there aren't a lot of trees, you can burn dried cow dung. It really is basically just processed grass. It burns really, really well. It can be a kind of building material, like rubbing it on the sides of homes and things like that, and huts and stuff, that kind of thing. So poop's really important, Perhaps the most important thing Harris found that living cows give you is traction. The truth is, you and I are very bad tractors. If we need to plant an area, we're pretty slow at it. We're just not a very big animal. But if I hook a plow up to a cow, buddy, I can plow a field in a day, right? I've actually done this in Ecuador. I've plowed fields that were hooked up to bovines, and I suck at it. None of my lines are straight; they go all over the place. But you can absolutely do it, right? With practice, you'd look a lot better at it than I did, right? But so it's the truth is in India, where this became, or the Indian subcontinent, right, where this became a religious idea. One of the things that Harris says is like there's a pretty narrow planting window between when you need to get your crops in the ground, when the monsoons are going to come, those kinds of things. Like, what's that growing window? And what he figured out was you can't plant enough crops on your own to make it through the year. You're just too slow. But you can if you use cows to pull a plow for you. And so while eating cows feeds you, it feeds you in the short term, right? In the long term, you starve to death. So by making a prohibition saying you cannot eat a cow, what it does is it says you can then make sure that you have the power, the cow power needed to get your crops in the ground. Right. And so the prohibition serves sort of long-term planning. Right. It also makes sense because, again, when this prohibition came about, it's not like we had refrigeration in the world. And so saying like, hey, we're going to eat cow. A cow's going to give you hundreds of pounds of meat. What the hell do you do with all of that if you don't have a deep freezer, if you don't have a refrigerator, right? Yeah, there's other techniques for you to preserve meat, but they don't work particularly well in the tropics. And if some of you aren't familiar with geography, a lot of India is in the tropics, okay? I've been to India. One of the days that I was there, it was 112 degrees, right? Meat doesn't preserve at those kind of temperatures, like it does, say, in the Arctic Circle for the Inuit. So they don't really have the means to store this, historically speaking. Of course, today is different, but historically speaking, they could not preserve this meat. There's another important thing that cows do or don't do, which is they don't compete with you for food. Cows and you and I don't eat the same thing. Cows eat grass. You and I can't digest that. Cows can go after you pick all of your, whatever out of the field, your crops out of the field, they can go through there and eat vines and wheat stalks and stuff like that. You and I can't eat that stuff. So a cow and I can exist in the same environment, and we're going to utilize different resources. So it doesn't really cost me anything to have a cow, right? Again, in a kind of older model of subsistence, not the big feedlots today where we're buying corn and shoving it into them to get them fat, right? But historically speaking, my cattle can just go graze on things that are grown wild. I don't have to grow them. I don't have to feed them. They're not taking away fruits and vegetables and nuts and potatoes or what the hell ever from me. They're eating other stuff. So a cow and I can live on this 5, 10, 20 acres, whatever, and it's okay. It's going to be fine, because we're not competing with one another like we do with some other animals, a la pigs. So the materialist perspective on why do Hindus say it is taboo to eat cow is because it's long-term planning. It's the best way to feed your family long-term. Eating them might lead you to starve to death. Cows are fine to have in your environment because materially we eat different things, all of that kind of stuff. And I would argue, let me say, that Indians today who are still practicing this are not dumb people. They're not relics of a bygone era. If you got rid of your cow, you could replace them with a tractor. Well, some of you might have an agricultural background, so you know this. Tractors can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yes, there's way cheaper ones, but when you talk about things like corn combines, it's pretty easy to spend $250,000 on them. That's a hell of a lot of money. Cows are quote unquote free. Cows make new cows. I don't have to go buy anything. Once my family has cattle, we can just keep breeding them and I don't have to go buy a new one. Likewise, that cow doesn't cost me anything. What I was talking about, the resources in the environment, it can graze. You get a tractor, you have to buy tires, you have to buy diesel, you have to buy hydraulic fluid, you have to buy new parts, you have to keep replacing it. Oh yeah, and when the monsoon comes, and they do every year, that tractor is going to sink in the mud and rust and be a worthless hunk of crap. That cow isn't, right? So it's still a very smart adaptation. Don't think of these cultures as just bygone relics. It's still a smart adaptation, right? Let me give you another perspective from anthropology, and this is from symbolic anthropology, from like Clifford Geertz, or even like there's a couple of others. I'm trying to think of their names, right? But it is basically the idea that the purpose, why cultures have religion, is symbolic. Okay, let me use the same example of cows. What symbolic anthropology claims is that cultural features like religion, or like a food taboo, like the Hindu prohibition on cows or the Jewish and Muslim prohibition on pork, is a way for us to communicate easily with one another the kind of person that we are. It's a way to show our ideology quite quickly, our character, our worth, our value, that kind of thing, right? So what symbolic anthropology says about this cow taboo is that it's not about the material world, but rather it's a way to say, listen, you and I, let's agree to some rules. And if we follow those rules, then you know I'm good people, because you and I down the road, you've got a son, your son gets older, I've got daughters, they get older, we're thinking about getting them married together. But the truth is, when our kids get married, I'm going to be stuck with you and you're going to be stuck with me forever, right? A marriage is really two families coming together, not two individuals, believe me, right? You're going to be seeing each other at all the holidays and all the school plays and all the parties and all the stuff in the community and all the religious holidays. So how do I know that you're a good person? How do I know that I want my daughter to be married to your son? And how do I know that I want my family to be forever linked to your family? There are certain ways that symbolically we can show each other by agreeing to rules, to saying, listen, you and I agree that this thing is right, is good, right? Whether it be not eating cows or not eating pigs or not eating snakes or not having multiple wives or whatever it is, we agree that this thing is good. And you can tell that I'm good people and I can tell you're good people because we don't do that. And so symbolically, the cow prohibition becomes important because it shows that I'm doing right. Okay, I'm the right kind of person, if that makes sense. Okay. So those are just two examples of the ways in which anthropologists come at different perspectives. The truth is, probably all of them are a little bit right. All of them have value in it. None of them are wrong, but it is the truth that in all actuality, all cultural behavior probably has more than one motivation, just as religion does. Okay, and historically we argued about what that motivation might be. Some of the early thoughts on this came from like Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud said that religion is a moral guideline, right? What I mentioned before is that it tells us what is proper behavior and it suppresses our deepest, darkest secrets. Well, no offense, like most things that Freud said, that's pretty incomplete, because the truth is, yeah, it can do that, right? Most religions have right and wrong. You like we were just talking about, you can't eat cow, or you can't eat pork, or you can't marry your aunt, or you can't have more than one wife, or you can't work on a specific day of the week, or things like that, right? It tells you what to do. The problem is that the majority of these rules don't have anything to do with our deepest, darkest desires, like murdering people or stealing stuff. Most of them talk about things that don't have anything to do with deep, dark desires, like eating shrimp or shellfish, or not planting two kinds of crops in one field. Most religious prohibitions have nothing to do with deep, dark desires of, jealousy and lust and rage and all of those kinds of things, right? So it doesn't quite make sense that that's its primary function. Likewise, there are religions that don't have any of that. There are religious ideas about the supernatural, about the spirits, that do not have anything about behavior, that they don't tell you what to do, right? And so that's a very Western idea. And so, like many things that Freud said, it's not that it's out and out wrong, but there's no way that it can actually serve the functions that he is claiming, right? In anthropology, we're not real big fans of Freud because as individuals that work cross-culturally, what we see is that Freud was talking about culture and behavior, and it might fit for the upper class Europeans that he studied, but that it damn sure doesn't work around the world. And usually it didn't even work for the middle and lower class people that were around him, right? And he was trying to talk about all of these universals and everything. And literally none of them are, right? Along with the fact that pretty much all of his research on sexuality is just odd and reflective of his own issues, and is, again, not something that we find to be culturally universal even a little bit, okay? Another guy that offered some insights into this is E.B. Tyler. And Tyler was one of the first anthropologists in the late 1800s. I'm a big fan of Tyler. He actually worked in Oaxaca, Mexico, where I did my research. But of the many things that he gave us, including the first scientific definition of culture, is an explanation for religion. And he said that religions were what he termed a cultural survival. And he said a cultural survival was something that used to serve a function, but no longer does. Okay, that it was an important thing at one time, but that cultures have changed and it doesn't do anything anymore, right? And so he said religion was one of these things. He argued that at one time, religion was there to explain, why people die and where do plagues come from and where do hurricanes come from and where the sun goes at night, and things like that, right? But he said we don't need it anymore. He said we don't need religion because it doesn't serve any function anymore. I have a couple of issues with this. And again, as a guy that is non-religious, I disagree with him. Religion still serves a lot of functions, like I was talking about, in terms of building community, functioning as a social safety net, as a marker of identity. Many people are quite proud of their religious identity, and it is very central to who they are. They stand up with pride and say, I am Jewish, I am Buddhist, I am a Muslim, I am a Christian, all of that, okay? So I think he got that wrong. Excuse me, apologize for sneezing there. I disagree. I think it does still function. And to be honest with you, this is an idea that's still very much around. If you read some prominent atheist writers like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, if you've seen the movie Religulous with Bill Maher, all of these guys are kind of noted atheists, and that's what they claim. It's like, well, yeah, religion used to do stuff, but now we have science, we don't need it anymore. I disagree. I think it serves a lot of functions. And again, I also think it serves functions that, like, yes, I can tell you where hurricanes come from and dust storms on the Sahara and how that affects warming temperatures in the ocean and how the jet streams change during a certain type of year and why warming waters then impact the development of these massive storms. Scientifically, I can tell you all of that. But you might still have questions of, like, why did it blow down every house in this neighborhood except mine? Hell, I don't know. It still serves a function of, why did my loved one die, and where did they go after they died? I don't know as a scientist, right? So I do still think it is something that for some individuals offers answers. And again, there's more than one answer to most questions when you talk about the complexity of human beings, right? So I disagree with him there, okay? One of the things that I wanted to mention is animism. I'm not going to run through everything in your book, as always, just because I don't want to waste your time. But animism is one that people often don't understand. And it is probably the oldest religious belief system that we've seen, which is a system organized around the idea that plants and animals and inanimate objects or even natural phenomenon have a spirit or a supernatural element. So rocks and trees and water and the sky and hurricanes, again, the word hurricane actually comes from the Maya word that that was the name of the god that was hurricanes, right? The hurricanes themselves were the manifestation of a Maya god, and we just borrowed the word of that god and applied it to that natural phenomenon, right? And so this is something that goes back a very, very long time. You still see it around. And again, it doesn't really have like a religious, like moral code with it. Trees have a spirit. The sky has a spirit, but it doesn't tell you how to behave. And the easiest way for me to describe this is almost like spirits and the supernatural here are like electricity. Electricity is a power, okay? It's not good, it's not bad, it doesn't love you, it doesn't hate you. It all matters what you use electricity for. So electricity can power a refrigerator to keep food from spoiling, which is good for you, excuse me. Electricity can be used to power a heart monitor that keeps us safe and alive. But electricity can also be used to power an electric chair that kills us, or a line that fall on the street that falls down in the street during a storm and electrocutes me, right? It can be used for all those things, okay? Electricity is not good or bad. It just is. It's just a power. It's how you use that power. Animism likewise says that, you know, these spirits or supernatural things are a power that exists. How you harness that power of the jaguar or of the sky or of the river can be used for good or bad, okay? And so that's kind of the idea behind it. In a lot of ways, and this sounds really nerdy, I know, what it is it's the idea of the Force from Star Wars. George Lucas is quite clear that he actually borrowed that. He said the Force is just animism. He was really big on like ancient myths, and Joseph Campbell, who's kind of a problematic guy, but he wrote like The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and I think like The Hero's Journey and stuff like that. He took that idea and just called it the Force, you know, because that's what it is. It's just a force that exists. What do you do with it? It can be good, it can be evil. It's how you utilize that force. Whereas we tend to think of personified deities in the West that are inherently good or evil, God or the devil or Allah or whatever, Yahweh, what have you. It's a little different than this, right? The book says something really weird here. The book says that animism, that defines animism separately, the idea of an impersonal supernatural power, or animatism. We would call that animism. I'm not really sure why this writer called it that, but just think of all of this as animism in that.